Shiga Naoya, Kinosaki ni te, at Kinosaki. Recitation of the Japanese original is forthcoming. Study guide forthcoming. Study guide video commentary also forthcoming. The translation here is by Lane Dunlop. I will provide a link to the PDF file in the description below. I was struck and thrown to the ground by a trolley car of the Yamanote line. To recuperate from my injury, I went by myself to a hot springs inn at Kinosaki in Tajima. If the injury to my back should develop into spinal tuberculosis, it might possibly prove fatal. But I was told by the doctor that that kind of thing was not at all likely. If nothing happened in 2 or 3 years, I would not have anything to worry about afterwards. In the meantime, I was told, it was important that I take good care of myself. So I had come here. I intended to stay more than 3 weeks, if I could stand it, for 5 weeks. I was still not quite clear in my head. My forgetfulness became acute, but my mood was calm as it had not been in recent years. I had a nice quiet feeling. It was the beginning of the rice harvest, and the weather also was fine. I was all alone. There was no one to talk to. I spent the day reading and writing, or sat in a chair outside my room vaguely looking at the mountains or the road, or else took walks. A good place for walking was the road that went up from the town by slow degrees alongside a small stream. There was a little pool at a bend in the stream around the foot of the mountain where trout congregated. If you looked more closely, you might discover big freshwater crabs with hairs on their claws sitting as still as stones. I often walked on this road before supper. As I went up along the small clear stream through the lonely autumn ravine in the chilly evening, my thoughts were often of unhappy things. There were lonely thoughts, but in them there was this nice quiet feeling. I often thought about my accident. An inch or two either way, I thought, and I would now be face up under the sod in the graveyard at Aoyama. With a pale, cold, stiff face, the cuts on it and on my back just as they were. The bodies of my grandfather and my mother would be by my side, and yet there would no longer be any communication between us. Such were the thoughts I had. Although they were lonely thoughts, they did not disquiet me all that much. Death would come sooner or later. Up until now, in my thoughts, I had pretty much assumed that it would be much later, in the far distant future. But now I felt that I truly did not know when it would come. In a book about the life of Lord Clive, which I read in middle school, it was written that Clive was encouraged by thinking to himself that there was something that had saved him from a likely death, had kept him alive for a work that he had to do. That was the way that I wanted to feel about my own brush with death, and I did have such a feeling. But in the end, my heart was curiously quiescent. Something like an affection for death arose within me. My room, being the only room on the second floor, was comparatively quiet. When I grew tired of reading and writing, I often went out to the chair on the veranda. Alongside me was the roof of the downstairs entryway. There was a wainscoting where it was joined to the house. In the wainscoting, in that wainscot there was evidently a wasp's nest. Every day, as long as the weather held, the corpulent tiger-striped wasps were out hard at work from morning almost until nightfall. When they emerged, brushing the sides of the loosely joined planks of the paneling, the wasps would descend to the roof of the entryway for a while. Then they would meticulously adjust their wings and antennae with their front and back legs. Then they would walk about a bit. All of a sudden, their slender wings stretched taut to either side. They lifted off with a resonant buzz. When they'd flown up like that, they suddenly shot way into the distance. The flowers of the yatsude being in bloom just then, the wasps clustered about its shrubbery. When I was bored, I would often watch the comings and goings of the wasps from the veranda railing. One morning, I spotted a wasp that had died on the roof of the entryway. Its legs tucked tightly under its stomach, its feelers were drooped untidily over its face. The other wasps were perfectly indifferent to it. Although they busily crawled around it on their way in and out of the nest, they showed no signs of being otherwise affected by it. Certainly the wasps, as they indefatigably went about their work, gave you an impression of the living creature, and the one wasp by their side that morning, noon and night, was always in the one place whenever I looked, absolutely still, tumbled over on its face, just as surely gave the feeling of something that had died. It stayed that way for about 3 days. Looking at it gave me such a feeling of quietness. It was lonely. In the evening, when all the other wasps had gone inside the nest, it was lonely to see that one little corpse remaining outside on the cold roof tiles. But what a quiet feeling it was. During the night, there was a heavy rainfall. In the morning, it was clear again. The leaves, the surface of the ground, and the roof were all washed beautifully clean. The wasp's body was no longer in its place. Already the wasps from the nest were energetically at work. Probably the dead wasp had been washed down through the eaves gutter to the ground. With its legs shriveled up and its feelers stuck to its face, covered with mud, it was probably lying still as a pebble somewhere. Until the next change in its surroundings that would move it occurred, the little corpse would most likely stay where it was, or would it be dragged away by ants? Whatever, it was certainly quiet. It was quiet because a wasp that had been nothing but busy had become absolutely still. I felt an intimacy in that stillness. A short while before, I had written a short story called Han's Crime, Han no Hanzai, from jealousy of an old premarital relationship between his wife and a man who was his friend, also abetted by his own psychological pressures. A Chinese called Han had murdered his wife. As I had written this story, it was mainly about Han's feelings. Now, however, I thought of writing a story about the feelings of his wife. Murdered at the end, under the ground of the cemetery, I wanted to write about that quietness of hers. I thought I would write The Murdered Wife of Han. I did not write the story after all, but the need for it had arisen in me. It was a feeling that differed greatly from the thoughts of the hero of a long story that I'd been working on before. I was at a loss. It was shortly after the wasp's body had been washed away, removed from my field of vision. One morning, thinking I'd go to Mount Higashi Park with its view of the Maruyama River and the Sea of Japan into which it emptied, I left the inn. From in front of a hot spring called Ichi no Yu, a small stream flowed gently down the middle of the road and entered the Maruyama River. When I came to a certain place, the bridge and sides of the stream were lined with people. They were having a good time watching something in the brook. What they were looking at was a big rat that had been tossed into the water. Desperately swimming, the rat was trying to get away. The rat's neck had been pierced with a fish skewer about 8 inches in length. 3 inches or so of it stuck out behind the head, and 3 inches or so stuck out from the throat. The rat was trying to climb up on the stone embankment. 2 or 3 children and a rickshaw man of about 40 were chucking stones at it. Their aim wasn't very good. With a clattering noise, the stones bounced back off the embankment. The onlookers were laughing loudly. The rat finally got a toehold between the stones of the embankment. But when it tried to climb up, the skewer immediately got in its way, and so it dropped back into the water. The rat was trying somehow to rescue itself. A human being could not understand the expression of its face, but it was clear by its actions that it was trying very hard. As if thinking that it could just get away somewhere, it would be safe. Still transfixed with the long skewer, the rat began to swim out towards the middle of the stream. Having more fun than ever, the children and the rickshaw man threw their stones. 2 or 3 domestic ducks that had been foraging for food in front of a laundry stone to the side were startled by the flying stones and craned their necks, goggle-eyed. The stones hit the water with a swift plunking sound. The ducks, their necks still stretched out, with silly expressions of dismay and squawks of alarm, made their way upstream with busily paddling feet. I had no heart to watch the rat's last moments. The appearance of the rat as it fled for its life with all its strength, laboring under a fate that would end in death, remained strangely in my mind. I had a lonely, unpleasant feeling. That was the truth. I thought to myself. Before the quietness that I aspired toward, there was that terrible suffering. I might have an affection for the quietness after death, but until I achieved that death, I would likely have a dreadful time of it. Creatures that did not know of suicide had to continue their efforts until they had finally done dying. If I were in a similar situation to the rats, what would I do? Wouldn't I struggle as the rat was doing? I could not but think of the time of my accident when I was close to death. I had tried to do everything that was possible. I had decided myself on the hospital. I had designated the way to go there, thinking that if the doctor were out, it would be inconvenient if the preparations for surgery were not ready upon my arrival. I requested that somebody phone ahead. Afterwards, it had seemed strange even to me that in the half-conscious state of mind had worked well on the most important things. The question of whether the injury was fatal or not was literally a matter of life and death. Although it was, I was almost completely unassailed by the fear of death. This also seemed strange to me. Is it fatal or not? What did the doctor say? I asked a friend who was standing by. He says it's not a fatal injury, I was told. This answer cheered me up immediately. From excitement, I became extraordinarily happy. How would I have acted if I'd been told it's fatal? I could not at all imagine myself in such a case. Perhaps I would have felt sad, but I had a feeling that I would not have been attacked by the fear with which one usually thinks of death. I would not have been attacked by the fear with which one usually thinks of death. I had the feeling that even if told I was dying, I would have thought all the more of doing something to save myself. Doubtless, I would not have been so different in that from the rat. Trying to imagine how it would be if that had happened now, I thought that probably it would be too much the same thing. Doubtless, what I hoped for would have no very immediate effect on how it was for me. And either way was all right. It was all right with me whether my hopes influenced my condition or not. There was nothing I could do about it. Sometime after the incident, I slowly made my way up along the little stream from the town one evening. When I crossed the tracks in front of the tunnel of the Yamakage line, the road became narrow and steep. The stream also became steep and swift. There were no houses at all around here. Thinking to myself that I would turn back, I kept walking until that place up there, on and on, around bend after bend. Everything was pale and faint. The air was cold on my skin. The quietness, on the contrary, somehow made me nervous. There was a big mulberry tree by the roadside. On the far side of the tree, on a branch that stretched out over the road, a single leaf was fluttering with the same rhythm. There was no wind, and aside from the stream, everything was quiet. In the midst of all that silence and stillness, the one solitary leaf was continually and agitatedly aflutter. It struck me as peculiar. I even felt slightly afraid, but I was also curious. Going down under the tree, for a while I looked up at the leaf. Then the wind began to blow, and as it did so, the moving leaf became still. The cause was evident. I thought that somehow I could understand such things better now. It was gradually growing dark. No matter how far I went, there was always another turning. I'll turn back here, I thought. Casually, I looked at the stream off to the side. On the slope of the far bank, on a flat rock that stood out of the water about half the size of a tatami mat, there was a small black creature. It was a water lizard. Still wet, it had a beautiful color. Its head lower, its stilly faced the stream from the slant rock. It did not move. The water that dripped from its body trickled about an inch down the dark, dry stone. I squatted down at ease and watched it. I was not as averse to water lizards as I once had been. I felt some liking for ordinary lizards. The lizards known as shrine guardians I detested above all others. As for water lizards, I neither liked nor disliked them. About 10 years earlier at Ashinomizu Umi, I often watched the water lizards gather around the spout where the wastewater from the inn ran off. I often got the feeling that it would be unbearable to be a water lizard. I thought of such things as what I would do if I was reborn as a water lizard. So, since at the time I had such thoughts when I saw the water lizards, I disliked looking at them. But now I no longer thought about such things. I thought I'd try to startle the water lizard and make him go into the water. I remembered the way they walked, clumsily swinging their bodies. Still squatting, I picked up a stone the size of a small ball that was by me, and I threw it. I wasn't particularly aiming at the lizard. I am so bad at taking aim and throwing something that even when I do my best, I come nowhere near the mark. I never thought that I would hit the lizard. After a clunking sound, the stone fell into the stream. Simultaneously with the sound, the lizard seemed to have leapt sideways around 4 inches. Around its tail, the lizard held it up high. Arching its tail, the lizard held it up high. I wondered what had happened. It did not occur to me at first that the stone had hit it. Quietly, of its own accord, the warped tail of the lizard came down. Squaring its elbows against the slope of the rock, the lizard, when the toes of its forefeet braced in front of it curled up inward, weakly tumbled forward. Its tail clung to the rock. It was motionless. The water lizard was dead. You've done a terrible thing, I thought. I had often killed insects and the like, but the fact that I had killed the lizard without at all meaning to pierced me with a strange unpleasantness. It was something I had done, of course, but it was absolutely fortuitous. For the lizard, it was a totally unexpected death. I squatted there for some while with the feeling that it was myself and the lizard now. I became as the lizard. I lived that feeling. I felt it was piteous, and at the same time I felt the loneliness of all life. By chance I had not died. By chance the lizard had died. With the lonely emotion, I came back down the road that I could hardly see in front of my feet towards the inn. Distantly, the lights at the edge of the town began to appear. What had become of the dead wasp? Probably the later rains had buried it under the earth already. What had become what had happened to the rat? Perhaps about this time, having been carried out to sea, its water-bloated corpse was being washed up on the beach together with some garbage, and I, who had not died, was walking along in this way. That was what I thought. I felt that it would not do for me not to be thankful. But in actual fact, no feeling of gratitude came welling up in me. Being alive and dying were not positive and negative poles. I had the feeling that there was not that much difference between them. It was quite dark by now. I merely felt that the distant lights were there, the sensation of walking separated from the sense of sight. It was very uncertain going. Only my mind went on willfully working. It drew me all the more into such a mood. Staying for about 3 weeks, I left that place. Already more than 3 years have gone by since then. I did not come down with spinal tuberculosis after all. That much at least I was spared.